He said he was freezing and pulled me under the blanket with him. I didn't plan for that night to change anything. It was supposed to be just another winter evening in our shared apartment. Me on the couch, hoodie on, headphones in, scrolling through my phone. Him in his room, probably playing his guitar or watching YouTube videos with the volume up too loud. We weren't best friends. Not exactly. More like housemates who had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. I'd known him for almost 2 years, but most of our interactions stayed on the surface, casual, safe, unthreatening. We joked about the leaky shower, complained about the neighbors upstairs, split pizza when neither of us wanted to cook. It wasn't that I didn't like him. If anything, maybe I liked him too much. I noticed things I shouldn't have noticed. The way his hair curled at the ends when he let it grow too long. The sound of his laugh muffled through the walls. The faint cologne he wore that lingered in the hallway. And I hated myself for noticing, because he wasn't mine to notice. I didn't know if he liked guys, and I wasn't brave enough to find out. That night, it was bitterly cold. The kind of cold that seeps in even with the heat on. I'd wrapped myself in the thick blanket my sister had given me last Christmas, curled up in the corner of the couch like a cat, a mug of tea in my hands. I was halfway through a documentary when his door creaked open. "Dude," he said, shivering a little, "it's freezing." He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt in the middle of December, and his hair was a little messy like he'd been lying in bed for hours. "Turn on your heater," I said, glancing at him over the top of my mug. "It's broken," he replied with a groan, rubbing his arms. "I called the landlord, but you know how that goes." I was about to make some sarcastic comment when he crossed the room and without asking, without hesitating, sat down next to me on the couch. Next to me wasn't quite accurate. He sat against me, shoulder pressed to shoulder, thigh pressed to thigh, like we'd done this 100 times before. I froze, not because I minded, but because I couldn't remember the last time I'd been that close to someone. And then, before I could even process it, he leaned in and said, "Move over," tugging at the edge of my blanket. "What?"
"I'm freezing."
"Scoot." I laughed nervously but shifted enough for him to pull the blanket over himself. It was a big blanket, but not that big. His legs brushed against mine under the fabric, and his arm rested along the back of the couch behind me. His body was warm now, or maybe it was just my imagination making heat bloom in my chest. The TV flickered in front of us, but I couldn't pay attention to the screen. I could feel his breathing. I could smell that faint trace of his cologne again, mixed with the shampoo I'd seen in our bathroom. "This is better," he murmured, and I didn't know if he meant the warmth or the closeness. I tried to act casual, but my hands were tense around my mug. "So, your guitar playing keep you busy tonight?" He chuckled. "You always hear me, huh?" "I'm not deaf," I said, smiling faintly. We fell into a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, just charged. Every tiny movement felt amplified. When his knee shifted and brushed mine, it was like an electric current shot through me. At some point, he leaned forward to grab the remote, and his hand brushed my leg. I thought maybe it was an accident, but then he didn't move away right away. "You're warm," he said. Just that, like it was a fact worth noting. "You're not," I replied, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He grinned. "Guess that's why I'm here." And then, God help me, he shifted even closer, until I could feel the weight of his head resting briefly against my shoulder. I told myself not to read into it. He could just be the kind of guy who didn't care about personal space. Or maybe he really was that cold. But there was a part of me, a reckless, buried part, that wanted to believe there was more. The movie ended without me remembering a single detail of it. When the credits started rolling, he didn't move. Instead, he sighed, that slow, deep sigh people make when they don't want to get up. "You know," he said softly, "you're pretty good to have around." It hit me harder than it should have. "You too," I managed. When he finally stood up, he left the blanket draped over me, but the warmth of his body stayed. I sat there for a long time after he went back to his room, staring at the blank screen. My tea had gone cold. My hands were still trembling. I didn't know it then, but that was the first night we'd blur the lines. The first night I'd start asking myself questions I wasn't ready to answer. And the first night I'd realize how dangerous a blanket could be. For the next few days, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. The way he'd leaned into me, the way his voice had softened when he said I was good to have around. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. If I let it be more, I'd be in trouble. But still, my body remembered the weight of him beside me. The warmth, the scent, the electric pulse that had threaded through the air. And I hated that I couldn't just file it away as a harmless moment between friends. He acted completely normal afterward, like it hadn't meant anything. He came into the kitchen the next morning, hair sticking up in every direction, yawning as he poured cereal. "Morning," he mumbled, like we hadn't been wrapped in the same blanket for 2 hours the night before. I tried to match his nonchalance. "Morning." The problem was, I wanted it to happen again. And wanting it was dangerous. The opportunity didn't come right away. It was almost a week later, another freezing night. I was sprawled on the couch again, reading this time, when I heard his door creak open. "You're hogging the good blanket," he said, pointing. I looked down at it. "It's my blanket." "Yeah, but you're not even using it right," he said with a mock frown. "Move over." My heart thudded. "Don't you have a hoodie or something?" He ignored me, walking over like it was already decided. This time, when he sat down, he didn't just sit next to me. He flopped against me, his shoulder pressing into my chest, his legs stretching out along the couch so his calves rested against mine. "You're ridiculous," I muttered, but I shifted the blanket to cover both of us. "See? That's better," he said, his voice low, almost content. We didn't talk much, just sat there. I could feel his breathing slow, feel the rise and fall against my side. At one point, I thought he might have fallen asleep, but then he said, quietly, "You're like a human heater." I smiled faintly, even though my pulse was pounding. Glad I could be of service. This time, I didn't fight the urge to look at him. His eyes were half-lidded, his hair falling into them, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. And for a dangerous, fleeting moment, I thought, what if I just... No. I looked back at my book, pretending to read. We stayed like that for almost an hour. When he finally moved, it was slow, reluctant. "Thanks," he said. And I couldn't tell if he meant for the warmth, the company, or something else entirely. After that, it became a thing. Not every night, but often enough. Sometimes he'd claim his heater was still broken. Sometimes he didn't even bother with an excuse. He'd just walk in, grin at me, and lift the blanket like it was our unspoken invitation. The more it happened, the harder it got to pretend it didn't mean something to me. I noticed how his hand would sometimes rest near my leg under the blanket, fingers brushing lightly when he shifted. How he'd lean his head against my shoulder and leave it there a little too long. How his voice would drop when we talked in those moments, like we were sharing a secret. One night, after we'd been sitting like that for a while, he suddenly said, "You ever notice how quiet it gets when it snows?" I blinked, thrown by the sudden shift. Yeah, I guess. It's like everything's muffled, like the world's holding its breath. He turned his head, looking at me. I like it. There was something in his expression, soft, almost vulnerable, that made my chest tighten. I wanted to ask why he was telling me that, why it felt like he was telling me something else entirely. But before I could, he looked away, his hand brushing mine under the blanket in a way that felt almost deliberate. It was small, barely anything, but my skin burned where we touched. That night, when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept looping back to that look in his eyes, the weight of his head against me, the ghost of his fingers on mine. I started wondering about things I'd never let myself wonder before. What it would feel like to hold his hand. What it would be like if, one night, he didn't just pull me under the blanket, if he pulled me closer. And I hated that I didn't know if I was imagining the whole thing. Because if I wasn't imagining it, then what? One cold Sunday evening, the answer almost came. He came in without knocking, without saying anything, and just dropped down beside me. We were watching some old sitcom reruns, the laugh track filling the room. At some point, his hand slid under the blanket again, brushing my thigh. But this time, it stayed there. Not moving. Not fidgeting. Just there. I froze, my eyes fixed on the TV but not seeing a thing. The sound of my heartbeat was so loud I was sure he could hear it. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, but his hand stayed, and slowly, painfully, I let mine rest closer. Not touching, not quite. The space between our hands felt like the thinnest layer of ice. One wrong move and it would shatter. And I think maybe that's exactly what we both wanted. The laugh track from the TV rolled on, filling the silence between us. His hand was still there, warm through the thin layer of fabric on my sweatpants, and I was hyper-aware of every tiny shift in his breathing. I didn't dare look at him. I was terrified that if I met his eyes, whatever spell we'd fallen under would break. But then, his fingers moved. Just a little. Just enough that I could tell it wasn't an accident. I glanced over before I could stop myself. He was staring straight at the screen, expression neutral, but the corner of his mouth was curved in the faintest trace of a smile. Like he knew exactly what he was doing. My throat felt dry. "You, okay?" He didn't answer right away. Then he tilted his head slightly toward me and said, "Yeah, warm now." It was such a simple sentence, but the way he said it, soft, low, almost teasing, made my chest feel too tight. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat there, under the same blanket, with that small point of contact that said more than I wanted to admit. By the time the sitcom ended, I wasn't sure if an hour had passed or 5 minutes. When he finally pulled his hand back, it was slow, reluctant. He stood, stretched, and said, "Night, night." I echoed, but my voice came out uneven. After he left, I sat there staring at the blank TV screen, my heart still hammering. I couldn't pretend anymore that this was just about staying warm. The next morning, I woke to the sound of snow against the window, soft, steady, almost like static. I shuffled into the kitchen, still half asleep, and found him there making coffee. He looked up at me, eyes still heavy with sleep, and said, "Hey, want some?" I nodded, rubbing my eyes. "Thanks." We didn't talk about the night before. It was like it never happened. But something in the air between us had changed, subtle but undeniable. Over the next week, the blanket moments became more frequent. Sometimes he'd end up pressed so close our knees would touch. Sometimes his hand would rest on my arm or shoulder like it belonged there. One night, we were watching some documentary he'd picked. The couch was small enough that our hips brushed, our legs half-tangled under the blanket. Halfway through, he leaned his head back against the couch and looked at me instead of the screen. "You ever think about how weird it is?" he asked. I frowned. "What is?" "That we live with people for years and never really know them." I hesitated. "I think I know you." His smile was small but real. "Do you?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him I knew he always hummed when he cooked pasta, that he hated the sound of the bathroom fan, that he pretended not to care about birthdays but always remembered mine. I wanted to say I noticed everything, more than I should. Instead, I just said, "I think so." He looked at me for a moment longer, then turned back to the TV. But he didn't move away. If anything, he leaned a little closer. It was a slow build, whatever this was. Small touches, quiet moments, never anything outright. But each one chipped away at the space I tried to keep between us. Then came the night it broke. It was snowing hard, the kind of snow that blankets the streets in silence. The heat in the apartment was struggling to keep up, and I was buried under my blanket on the couch, reading. He walked in wearing pajama pants and a hoodie, hair damp like he'd just showered. Without a word, he flopped down next to me and burrowed under the blanket. "God, it's cold," he muttered, tucking his legs up and pressing his knees against my side. "You're a menace," I said, but I shifted to give him room. Somewhere in the middle of whatever we were watching, I realized his arm was around my back, not just resting, holding me. His hand was on my side, fingers curled lightly in the fabric of my shirt. I froze. He didn't. The TV flickered, the snow fell outside, and my pulse roared in my ears. After a while, I said quietly, "You're holding me." "Yeah." he replied, just as quiet. Why? His hand tightened slightly. Because I want to. I turned my head then, because I couldn't not. He was looking at me, and his expression was unreadable but soft. We stayed like that, looking at each other for what felt like forever. And I swear, in that moment, the air between us shifted entirely. I don't remember leaning in. I don't think he does either. It was like something invisible was pulling us together, closing the gap inch by inch until his forehead was almost touching mine. The TV's noise blurred into nothing. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding so hard it almost hurt. He didn't kiss me, not then, but he didn't move away either. His gaze flicked from my eyes to my mouth, and back again, like he was trying to decide something. Finally, he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head, and pulled back just enough to rest it against my shoulder instead. It was such a simple gesture, but it left me reeling. We didn't talk for the rest of the night. We just stayed there, pressed together under the blanket, the weight of his arm around me like it had always been meant to be there. When he eventually got up and went to bed, I sat there long after, my whole body still humming. I didn't know if I wanted to thank him or scream. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been nothing. Almost. But the truth was, I could still feel the ghost of his touch hours later. The snowstorm kept us indoors for the next couple of days. We fell into the strange rhythm, making breakfast together, watching movies, sharing that blanket without a second thought. If anyone else had seen us, they probably would have thought we were dating. But we didn't talk about it. We didn't name it. We just existed in it. Then came the night when pretending we were just friends stopped being an option. It was late. The lights were low. The only sound was the quiet rumble of the heater and the occasional creak from the old apartment walls. I was curled up in my usual corner of the couch when he came in holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He handed one to me without a word, then slid under the blanket beside me. Thanks, I murmured, blowing on the steam. He smiled faintly. Figured you could use it. You've been reading for hours. I glanced at him over the rim of my mug. You've been watching YouTube videos for hours. He chuckled. Touché. We sat there sipping in comfortable silence, the kind that feels earned. At some point, he shifted closer, draping an arm casually along the back of the couch behind me. Then his hand slipped from the couch to my shoulder, and stayed there. It should have been nothing, but it wasn't. Hey, he said after a while, voice quiet, almost tentative. Yeah. He hesitated. You ever think about what it'd be like if we... His voice trailed off. My pulse jumped. If we what? He looked down at his mug, like it might give him courage. Then he set it on the coffee table and turned toward me fully. If we didn't keep pretending. The words hung between us, heavy and electric. I started, but my voice failed me. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do, he said softly. He wasn't smiling now. He was looking at me like he'd been holding something in for months, maybe years. I felt the air leave my lungs. You're not just talking about the blanket, I said finally. No, his voice was steady, but his eyes searched mine like he was bracing for me to pull away. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of us. But suddenly his hand was on my cheek, warm and certain, and then his lips were on mine. It wasn't a cautious kiss. It wasn't testing or tentative. It was hungry, like we'd both been starving and finally found the only thing that could fill us. I kissed him back before I could think, before I could remember every reason why I shouldn't. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing hard. His forehead rested against mine, his thumb brushing my jaw. That, he whispered, is what I meant. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my heart. What does this mean? He gave a faint, almost disbelieving laugh. It means I've wanted to do that for a long time. And God help me, I realized I had too. We didn't move for a long time after that. Just sat there, pressed together under the blanket, his hand still cupping my jaw like he wasn't ready to let go. Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and steady, and the apartment felt like the only warm place in the entire world. When he finally leaned back, it wasn't far. He looked at me like he was memorizing something. The slope of my nose, the color of my eyes, the way my lips must have still been parted from the kiss. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. The words caught me off guard. For what? If I misread things? If I made this weird? I let out a shaky laugh. "You think you made it weird?" That pulled a small smile from him, but his eyes were still searching mine. "So, we're not pretending anymore?" I hesitated. I could feel the weight of what he was asking. This wasn't just about a kiss. It was about shifting everything we'd been, roommates, friends, safe, into something else, something riskier. "I don't want to pretend," I said finally. My voice was quiet but certain. He let out a slow breath, like he'd been holding it for months. Then he leaned in again, kissing me softer this time, slower. When we broke apart, he tucked himself against me, his head fitting perfectly under my chin. We stayed like that for hours, the TV still playing in the background, both of us pretending we weren't memorizing every detail. The days after that were strange. Not bad, just different. We didn't tell anyone. There was no official conversation about what we were, no labels. But the way we moved around each other changed. He'd pass me in the hallway and brush his hand against mine. He'd linger in the kitchen in the mornings, leaning against the counter, watching me make coffee with a faint smile like he was keeping a secret. And the blanket? It became our place. Not just for warmth, but for us. One night, maybe a week later, we were watching some dumb action movie he'd insisted on. I'd barely been paying attention because he'd been tracing patterns on my arm under the blanket the whole time. "You're not even watching," he teased, catching me staring at him instead of the screen. "Neither are you," I shot back. He grinned, leaning in just enough that I could feel his breath. "Maybe I'm watching something better." I rolled my eyes, but my chest tightened in that dangerous way again. It was good. It was so good until it wasn't. Because the more I let myself fall into it, the more I started to think about the ending. What if this was just a winter thing? A comfort thing? What if he woke up one day and decided the blanket was enough, but I wasn't? That fear sat in the back of my mind, quietly gnawing at me, even in the warmest moments. The crack came late one night in February. He'd been out with friends and I'd stayed home. I was half asleep on the couch when he came in, cheeks flushed from the cold, or maybe from the drinks. "Hey," he said softly, almost shyly, like he didn't want to wake me. "Hey," I murmured, sitting up. Without a word, he toed off his shoes and slid under the blanket with me. But this time he didn't sit upright. He lay down, head in my lap, looking up at me with tired, glassy eyes. "You're warm," he mumbled, like it was the only truth that mattered. I ran my fingers through his hair without thinking. "Long night," he hummed in response, eyes half closed. "Better now." Something about the way he said it, so soft, so certain, made my chest ache. I wanted to ask him what we were. I wanted to demand clarity. But looking down at him, with the snow still falling outside, I didn't have the heart to ruin it. So I stayed quiet, brushing his hair back until he drifted off, the weight of him anchoring me in place. And I wondered, not for the first time, if I was already too far gone to protect myself. A week later, the heater in his room finally got fixed. The landlord had sent some guy over in the middle of the afternoon, and within 20 minutes, the constant complaint about sleeping in a freezer was over. I told myself it didn't matter, that the blanket moments had been about convenience, about him avoiding his cold room and nothing more. But that first night after the repair, when I curled up on the couch alone, the space next to me felt wrong. Too empty, too quiet. Around midnight, I heard his door open. My heart leapt in my chest before I could stop it. I looked up, trying not to look too hopeful. "Hey," he said casually, leaning against the doorway. "Hey," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. He hesitated, then came over, and instead of heading to his now warm room, he sat down beside me like always. His eyes flicked to the blanket draped over my lap. I raised an eyebrow. "Your heater's fixed." He smirked. "Yeah, but this is better." And just like that, he pulled the blanket over himself, pressed against me, and everything fell back into place. I didn't say it, but in that moment, I realized the blanket had never really been about the cold. The thing is, once you cross that line, you can't uncross it. Kisses became more common, slow ones when we were tired, playful ones when one of us said something dumb. Sometimes he'd kiss my cheek when passing by in the kitchen, like it was the most natural thing in the world. But for all the small intimacies, we still hadn't talked about what we were. And the longer that conversation didn't happen, the more it weighed on me. One night in early March, the weight became too much. We were curled up under the blanket again, the TV playing something neither of us was watching. His hand was resting lazily on my thigh, tracing little circles through the fabric. I took a breath. "Can I ask you something?" "Yeah." "What is this?" His fingers stilled. He didn't look at me right away. "What do you mean?" I let out a frustrated laugh. "You know what I mean. We kiss. We sleep under the same blanket. We do this. But we don't talk about it." He finally looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "Do you need it to have a name?" "I need to know if it's real," I said quietly. Something flickered in his eyes. Something I couldn't read. "It's real," he said finally. The words should have been enough. But the way he said them, without elaboration, without promise, left me both relieved and uneasy. The unease lingered. Some nights he was all in, warm, affectionate, looking at me like I was the only thing in the room. Other nights he felt distant, even when he was right next to me. I told myself not to overthink it. But when you've spent years building walls around your heart, and someone starts pulling bricks out one by one, it's hard not to notice when they hesitate. The turning point came on a night that should have been perfect. It was still cold enough for the blanket, but spring was peeking through the air. We'd made dinner together, had a couple beers, laughed more than we had in weeks. At one point, we were lying on the couch, my head on his chest, his fingers absently tracing my arm. I remember thinking, maybe this is it. Maybe it's not as complicated as I make it. Then his phone buzzed. He shifted to look at it, and I felt his whole body change beneath me. "You okay?" I asked. He hesitated. "Yeah, just a friend." But he didn't meet my eyes. The rest of the night he was quieter. He still held me under the blanket, still kissed me goodnight, but there was a new distance there. And lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the fear that whatever we built under that blanket could unravel just as quickly as it started. Couldn't sleep that night. The warmth of his body beside me felt distant, almost unfamiliar. My mind kept replaying the way he'd stiffened when his phone buzzed, the way he hadn't looked at me the rest of the evening. By morning, I was exhausted, but I couldn't wait any longer. I had to know. He was in the kitchen pouring coffee. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across his face. He looked ordinary, casual, messy-haired, unaware of the storm raging in my chest. I took a deep breath. "Hey, we need to talk." He froze, cup halfway to his lips. "Okay," he said carefully. I sank into a chair, wrapping my hands around my mug. I don't know where we stand, and I need to." He hesitated, then leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. "I thought we were okay." "We're good," I said. "But is this us? Are we together?" His lips pressed into a thin line. He ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I like this, you, us, but I'm scared it'll get complicated." "Complicated?" I asked softly. "We've already made it complicated. Every time we're under that blanket, every time we kiss, it's complicated." He sighed, and the weight of it filled the small kitchen. "I know. I'm not sure I can promise what you want." I looked down at my mug, feeling the heat seep into my hands. "I don't need promises. I need clarity." He met my eyes then, and I swear I saw something break through the walls he built. "Okay," he said quietly. "We're together. We don't need to name it for everyone else. But for us, I don't want anyone else. Not you, not this." My chest tightened, a mix of relief and disbelief. "Really? Really?" he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "Just us, under the blanket." And in that moment, everything felt right. From then on, things shifted. We still had our blanket moments, but now they carried a different weight. Every brush of skin, every small touch, every kiss was no longer ambiguous. It was ours. We didn't announce it. We didn't need to. The warmth under the blanket, the quiet nights together, the small confessions whispered in the dark, that was enough. Sometimes, when the apartment was quiet and the world outside was frozen or snow-covered, we'd just lie there, bodies tangled, and talk about everything and nothing. Dreams, fears, regrets, hopes for the future. And sometimes, we'd just hold each other in silence, letting the heat between us speak for itself. The intimacy wasn't just physical. It was emotional, vulnerable, raw. The kind of closeness you don't find in casual flings or fleeting moments. It was trust and comfort and love, growing slowly, quietly, in the spaces between our words and under the covers of that one shared blanket. Spring finally came. The snow melted, and the air became warmer, but our blanket rituals didn't disappear. Sometimes we'd drape it over the couch on cold evenings. Sometimes we'd carry it out to the balcony, watching the city lights while huddled together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned pink and gold, he pulled me close under the blanket on the balcony. His hand found mine, fingers intertwining naturally. "You know," he said softly, "I was scared. Scared I'd mess it up. Scared I'd lose you. Scared this would be temporary." I leaned my head on his shoulder. So was I. Every night. He pressed a kiss to my temple. "But it's not temporary. I don't want it to be. Not this, not us." "I don't either," I whispered. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The city lights blinked below us, oblivious to the small world we'd created on that balcony. We were just two people, wrapped in a blanket, holding on to each other like it was the only thing that mattered. That night, we didn't need words. The blanket, the warmth, the closeness. It said everything we couldn't say aloud. From then on, life went on, work, friends, errands, weekends, but we carried that connection everywhere. The blanket remained a symbol, a comfort, a secret reminder of how something so simple could bring two people together in a way nothing else could. And every night, as we curled up together, the world outside might have been cold or chaotic or indifferent, but under that blanket, we were safe, warm, whole. We learned how fragile love can be, how it can tremble and falter in silence. But we also learned how resilient it can be, how it can grow quietly, persistently, until it becomes undeniable. And every time he'd pull me under the blanket, every time he whispered, "You're warm," or held my hand a little tighter, I felt it again. That raw, breathtaking intimacy that had started one cold night and refused to let go. We weren't perfect. We argued sometimes. We worried about the future sometimes. But we always came back to the blanket, to each other, to the quiet certainty that we had found something rare, fragile, and infinitely ours. And that, I realized, was all that mattered.